Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui, coming to you live from Beijing. America often stands accused of blatantly ignoring its history, with self-righteous platitudes by its leaders perpetuating the myth of American exceptionalism. It's a rationalization which is often used to justify America's policies and its actions, both at home and abroad. The core of the myth is that the U.S. is fundamentally a good and righteous country which acts only on the principles of fairness and humanitarianism. And the myth is very often backed up by Hollywood, but not always. The historical whitewash has always annoyed Academy Award-winning filmmaker Oliver Stone. It leads him to create a unique documentary series, The Untold History of the United States, which delves into the dark recesses of America's past. How should history be presented? What should American and Chinese filmmakers do to be true to their craft and their conscience? Today, we are honored to be joined by three-time Academy Award-winning director, producer, and screenwriter Oliver Stone.
Platoon, Natural-Born Killers, and Midnight Express. Famous movies that point to one figure, Academy Award-winning director Oliver Stone. Stone is famous for writing and directing a series of films about the Vietnam War. He first went to Vietnam as a teacher after dropping out of Yale University. In 1967, he returned as a US soldier. He won numerous military honours, and his service inspired his later artistic creations. Stone's first film in his Vietnam trilogy, Platoon, was released in 1986. He drew on his personal experiences to try to redefine the way the war was portrayed on screen. The film received widespread acclaim and won Stone his first Oscar for Best Director. David Halberstam, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the Vietnam War, praised Platoon as the first real film about Vietnam and one of the greatest war movies of all time. The trilogy was completed with Born on the 4th of July in 1989 and Heaven and Earth in 1993. Both won great success. Contemporary and controversial American political and cultural issues also feature heavily in Stone's films, such as JFK, Natural-Born Killers, and Nixon. He's also made several documentaries, including 3 on Cuba's former leader Fidel Castro and 1 on Venezuela's late leader Hugo Chavez.
Welcome back, gentlemen.
Hello, Jerry.
Do you produce films for the American audience or for a global audience?
I make the films for a global audience and for myself too.
How could you be true to your conviction, your faith, and the sense of professionalism as a Hollywood producer? Because most of the time the Chinese audience here have a strong feeling that the American blockbusters are very patriotic, and yet in many of your masterpieces you are very critical of the American policies.
Well, this is a very tough question. I mean, I'm a dramatist, I'm a storyteller, and part of being a dramatist, an honest one, is to find out as you go in your life, as you get older, what really happened in your life. Sometimes it's not clear. I grew up as a young man, I grew up very conservative, I grew up very pro-American in my thinking. I went to Vietnam as a soldier. I fought there, as you know, and I came out of the war and I was shocked. It took me a long time to understand the geopolitical process that went into the war. It would take 10 years. It doesn't happen overnight. And over the 1980s, under the Ronald Reagan administration, I started to change. And I started to become more critical of the United States policies in Central America and around the world. I made movies about it, Platoon and Salvador. And over the course of the next 25 years, I evolved as a filmmaker. I started to make, I think, more progressive movies.
What do you mean by progressive movies?
Not just about our history in Vietnam, the dirty side, the ugly side, the dark side of the moon, but also about presidents like John Kennedy, presidents like Richard Nixon. And eventually I did a movie on George W. Bush in 2008, if you remember correctly. It was called W, which was also, it is a movie that looked at at the fallacies of his administration in the war in Iraq in 2003. At that point in 2008, after I had done some 19 movies as a director, I decided I really wanted to apply myself to understand why if George Bush was an aberration or if he was a continuation of a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And with my colleague, a professor of history at the American University, Peter Kuznick, we went back and we did a 12-hour documentary series called The Untold History of the United States.
What did you say in the Untold History?
It's also a book of 700. It's 700 pages. It's 12 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But we are basically looking at the United States as a national security state, which came about after World War II. And it was not voted on. It was just happened that we declared the Russians were an enemy to the United States and the Chinese, and we went into a Cold War. At that point, we militarized ourselves in an extraordinary fashion, which continued even after communism in the Soviet Union fell in 1991. We continued to militarize. And when George Bush declared war in Iraq, it was a continuation of that policy. And unfortunately, it's had, as we can discuss, we've had very negative consequences for the world as well as for my own country. So,
yes,
you asked what the series was about. I just want to make one point is, you know what it's about, and it took me a long time. It took me 5 years to make the series. It's about mourning my country. It's about, it's grieving for the tragedy, the loss of purpose, the loss of a good purpose. World War II was an important war. We defeated fascism along with the Soviet Union. Very important victory. But we lost the meaning of that war quickly. By 1947, we had descended into another war, a Cold War. And I think that's very important because if you go back to the root causes of Vietnam, the root causes of many of Iraq, Afghanistan, you have to go back to the beginning, the end of World War II.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you have talked to your Chinese friends about the image of the U.S. For most of the scholars who do research about the U.S., history, politics, economy, they think there are two images about your country. One is the empire for its foreign policy, global hegemony. The other is domestic democracy. Now, when we look at the issue of empire, what do you think of the importance of maintaining the notion of a nation state? Because we are still enslaved by this notion, nation state. We have the issue of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and therefore we go out using force to defend our sovereignty. In your movies, what do you want to say?
Listen, every human being is born, generally speaking, in a country, and you feel a certain devotion and a love for that country. It's like having a mother. You never turn your back on your mother.
Are you patriotic?
I was patriotic, but I want to be patriotic in the right cause. If my country starts to do bad things, if I had been born in Germany in the 1920s and all of a sudden we were aggressing the rest of Europe and going and attacking the Soviet Union, I would have probably felt very poorly about my country. When the United States went into Vietnam, when it went into Iraq, when it went into Afghanistan, when it went into Kuwait, when you study these wars, it is very ugly, and you cannot agree with the policy of your country.
If you openly disagree, you would be arrested.
That is correct. If you openly disagree in some countries, but not in the United States, we do have a tradition of dissent in our country.
To display your decency as an individual.
We have the rule of law, so to speak. We have supposedly free elections, although they're increasingly controlled by big money and corporations. If it takes $1 billion to become president in the United States, you have to question the meaning of democracy. It becomes an oligarchy.
Oliver,
rich people.
You know, if you criticize the money politics in American democracy, you're fine because you are an American citizen. But if I were to criticize this aspect of American money politics, then they say, hey, this is a state-run media. He's the voice. Yang Rui is the voice of the state-run media, CCTV News. So this is an issue of ideology. Now, China tends to be examined with an ideological lens. Do you think in an age of globalization, when we look at the sense of history, the sense of justice, do we have to employ ideology to get the job done?
I'm not sure what you're saying, because what is the Chinese ideology that you're referring to? Is it communism, socialism? What is the ideology you mean?
I cannot give you a clear answer from my perspective. I appreciate the fact that what we are doing here is a dialogue, is a conversation. My understanding is that since the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, China, what China's been doing is to depoliticize, to de-ideologize what we're doing, which is concentrate economic reconstruction and improvement of the livelihoods for ordinary folks, for the underprivileged. So I'm not sure if we have the so-called official ideology that we practiced in a brutal way during the Cultural Revolution.
That's a very country. Yes, I think the country is fascinating. I've been coming to China since 1990. I was I've seen some of the transformation. I was at the Shanghai jury president in 1993, and I've come back to China many times, and I even have an apartment in Beijing. I love the Chinese people, and I've run into my share of problems too, trying to make movies here in China. But I've had the same problems all over the world. I mean, if it's hard in the United States. I mean, we talk about freedom of ideas, a free marketplace, but frankly, it's an economic marketplace where if your ideas are not, let's say, politically correct, so you cannot make them in the capitalist market because no one will finance them. If you make a movie that is critical of the United States, you have to be careful. Maybe those type of movies were made in certain periods in the 1970s, early 70s. There was more, because that was the end of the Vietnam War, and people were making movies that were criticizing the United States policy in Vietnam. That was a certain period. But now it comes back after Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. It came back into a much more conservative direction. Right now in Hollywood, the reigning mentality is box office, big dollars. Big billions of dollars. And
you refuse to be a slave to by commercialization.
Well, I refuse to be a slave to money. My father was a Wall Street stockbroker, which is the reason I did Wall Street. But, you know, being beholden to money, it puts you in a very compromising position. And I think the world, as it's run now by the let's call it the globalization, the capitalist globalization of the world, which is being pushed by the United States.
Do you think it's high time for us to de-Americanize and
I
to
think it's very
regularize?
dangerous. It's very dangerous. Capitalist globalization is ruining the world. I think what the ecological crisis that we're facing and you're facing in China is enormous. It's scary, and everyone who's got some brains and pays attention has to be scared about the future and the future of our children. I mean, I don't see the cities, the overpopulation of the world, the pollution that I see in Beijing and the pollution I've seen in Shanghai is shocking to me.
From day one of China's opening up in 1978, what we started to do was to import not only products from the United States and the European countries, but also the idea of a capitalism from the US. Yeah. Now, it seems that consumerism instead of Confucianism starts to
I totally agree with you. I know where you're going.
To control the minds of the young hearts, of the young people. Now let's come back to examine a very sensitive issue. The image of Edward Snowden. Do you think he's a national hero or he has betrayed his own country?
I've been very supportive of Snowden. I think
that's very dangerous. I feel surprised.
Well, I've been supportive of him because I think it was necessary to bring proof to the American public that Mr. Bush had gone haywire after the 2001 attack, and he instituted a policy of a national security state that was bar none the worst in the world in terms of eavesdropping. We have a high ability of technology in the United States to eavesdrop on all its citizens in the world. We have 100% coverage of people in Afghanistan.
In the name of fighting terrorism?
In the name of fighting terrorism, also in the name of economic control, diplomatic control. The WikiLeaks revelations pointed to much of this. I would say, basically we broke our Constitution. I don't know if you know the American Constitution. The right to privacy is sacred. They may not be so in other countries.
But the right to privacy could be sacrificed for the sake of protecting national interests.
Well, that's what they always say.
That's what they always say.
But when the American Revolution happened, that's what the British said. They said that we have the right to come in and do what we want in America. We can arrest who we want. There is no legal procedures. The American revolutionaries fought the British on the basis that they did not want to have their homes searched and seized or quartered. So in other words, it's very important not to panic in moments of crisis. We're always under danger. There's always problems that occur. And there's national crises. We've had World War II. We had World War I. We've had the American Civil War. We've had enormous issues of panics, depressions. We have never gone to this degree of reaction as we have under Bush and Obama to this concept of terror. which is, I think, very dangerous, because this terror attack is a very limited group of people who are causing these problems.